Good afternoon, everyone, and you're very welcome to this MaREI webinar called Ideas That Can Change Our Lives. I'm delighted to welcome you to this event. It's one of a series of webinars that we're running during the summer, and we've already hosted events on offshore wind energy, energy policy, retrofitting of homes, but this one is quite different and quite special. I'm particularly delighted to be able to welcome Mary McAleese, former President of Ireland, to join us in a conversation at the early stage in this event. So for those of you who don't know us, MaREI is one of the Science Foundation Ireland research centres of scale, and there are 17 of these research centres, and within MaREI we focus on research related to the energy transition, climate action and the blue economy. So we comprise about 220 researchers in Ireland, spread across 13 universities and research institutes. And the focus of what we do is to undertake excellent research that has impact. And we've three particular strategic areas of impact. One is to support business, another is to inform policy, and the third one is to empower society. And this latter one is one that we've been developing over the last number of years, with a focus on working with energy communities, engaging with citizens, and exploring how society can engage more effectively and more fully in the energy transition. And this project emerges from this area of research that we've been undertaking on empowering society. So I'm delighted to hand over to my colleague Clodagh Harris, from the Department of Politics and Government in University College Cork. Clodagh has been at the helm of this project and also has been very involved over the last number of years in research related to improving and increasing democracy in Ireland, supporting the Citizens' Assembly and the very interesting deliberations they had on climate change and on a number of other topics. So Clodagh, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian, and good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Thank you very much for joining us today for our first Deep Institutional Innovation for Sustainability and Human Development webinar. So that's DIIS for short. Currently, we're at a moment of crises. The climate emergency, marked increases in inequality, economic crises, racism and the heightened racial tensions provide clear evidence that current social institutions are not optimal for addressing modern global challenges and human flourishing. The coronavirus pandemic has brought this dangerous reality into even starker relief as it highlights both the deep interconnectedness and sheer fragility of our globalized socioeconomic environmental systems. The crises we face require approaches and reimagined institutions that radically go beyond the mere technical and economic. They require not only fundamental innovations in our major social institutions such as democracy, economics, technology, gender and religion, but also new imaginaries to guide the direction of these transformations. These are the matters that are at the heart of our DIIS project, which aims to lay the foundations for a critique and reimagining of our major social institutions and the development of principles and ideas for guiding the transformations required to address the climate emergency in a manner that ensures climate justice. Our project is an interdisciplinary international collaboration comprising academics from MaREI, drawn from the Departments of Government and Politics, Process and Chemical Engineering, the School of Sociology and Criminology in UCC, the School of History, Anthropology, Philosophy and Politics in Queen's University Belfast, the OECD New Approaches to Economic Challenges Unit Paris, and Values Bergenland Austria, as well as the Humanistic Management Network. Our work wishes to start a series of conversations on the meaning and direction of the current deep transformations and to contribute to the debate in Ireland's possible future pathways in the context of sustainability, climate justice and human development. This afternoon marks the first of these conversations, and we are very honoured to be joined by Professor Mary McAleese, whose work embodies the principles of partnership, cooperation, empowerment and societal development that underpin our definition of a good social institution in time of transformation. Professor McAleese was President of Ireland from 1997 to 2011, and the first person born in Northern Ireland to hold the office. Prior to becoming president, she was a barrister, an academic serving as Reid Professor of Law in Trinity College Dublin, a journalist working with the Irish state broadcaster RTE, and in 1994 she became the first female pro-vice-chancellor of Queen's University Belfast. The themes she adopted through her presidencies were social inclusion, equality and the promotion of reconciliation, dialogue and consensus. She is ideally located to start our conversation today, bringing with her a wealth of experience and expertise, and I'm very honoured to pass over to her now and to our colleague on this project, Dr. Ian Hughes, Senior Researcher at MaREI. Thank you.
Thank you, Clodagh. So, hello, Mary.
Hi, Ian. How are you?
I'm very
hello,
well.
Everybody who's listening or watching.
So it's wonderful to see you. I just want to start by opening a few words of thanks to open. I mean, you do a huge honour to MaREI and to UCC, to the project, and a huge honour to me personally, and I want to thank you for that before we begin. Just to repeat very quickly some of what Clodagh has just said, just as a context for the conversation, because it's a different kind of conversation that I'm hoping that we can have. So the premises of the project are, as Clodagh said, first of all, that we're in a very different time. We're a very strange time. It's a time of enormous change. There's a huge number of crises that are happening at the same time. The pandemic is the most pressing one, but of course there's climate change, there's huge inequality now that has built up over this past number of decades, and there's hatred. You know, that's also evident around the world. We say at these times there's a real danger of sources of toxicity. We've seen this in history. There's a real danger at times of change and the chaos that happens at these moments of real transformative change, of toxicity getting into power and leading those transitions in very dangerous directions. So part of the project and part of the conversations that we want to have are around really rethinking the social institutions in society that guide, first of all, that select our leaders. You know, our leaders come through these social institutions, but also they guide our own behaviour. They provide the norms and values for our own behaviour. So how can we rethink these institutions in order to contain this toxicity and to try and empower people who are working for fairness and sustainability and human rights and a better world? So as Clodagh was saying, when we've been working on this project now since towards the end of last year, and when it came to talk to someone about these issues, yours was the first name that came up, because you have lived experiences at the highest level, not only as former president twice, you know, but also in academia as a human rights activist, but also, and I use the word agitator, I hope you don't mind me using that word.
No, that's perfectly fine.
But also someone who's really trying to change the structures, really trying to change the structures to have more equality and to try and make these institutions function much better in terms of moving us to a better place. So also, just if one of our themes is reimagining, you've also personally been reimagining yourself and reimagining the world around you since you were a girl in Belfast. You know? And you've done that numerous times in your life. So I'm hoping that in the conversation we can tap into your experiences, your wisdom, and to talk about the moment, this historic moment that we're at, and how can we reimagine these institutions. So just to begin with, if I could ask your reflections on this very strange time we're in terms of COVID, and your assessment, is this really an opportunity for the type of transformation that we're hoping for?
Well, in one sense, almost every day presents an opportunity that we can take and use for transformation. One of the great human capacities, it seems to me, is the capacity to change. that famous phrase of Newman, you know, that to be human is to change, and to be perfect is to have changed often. I think that's one of the, it's what brings us together, you know, in this conference, in this dialogue, because we believe that there is a powerful opportunity for persuasion to do things better. But before we can do things better, we have to critique what it is that we perceive to be wrong. We have to be capable of an openness, particularly an openness to the things that that bind us and also hold us, almost in awe of them. The big institutions that are almost, have made themselves almost hermetically sealed from being critiqued. I think we have to step into that unafraid space to say, we really need, just as we have deep cleansed our homes, we need to deep cleanse our society, our minds. And that means, I think, looking at what is it in our society that could be changed, and changed for the better, but is not going to be changed unless we really probe right to the very depths, you know, really take out the drill and drill deep, and courageously and convincingly. The space that I'm in, and have been since I left office, is the space of religion in our world. And in particular, looking at the faith system that I was educated and brought up in. On the one hand, the Christian faith, and the second hand, the Catholic faith, in an environment where it was extraordinarily strong. And yet here we are today with an institution that, typical, I think, of, it's not the only faith system that this can be said of, is one of the most powerful key influencers, not just of today's world, but of the past, and all the thought processes and all the structures, legal structures, for example, legal thinking that we inherited. And somehow along the way, we've managed to allow those structures, that big holy space, that religious space, to hermetically seal itself from internal critique. So that all internal critique is almost seen as subversive, or, as you said, you know, you used the word agitator, stirrer-upper. It seems to me that no institution is beyond criticism. No institution that has grown, that carries the human, person, carries us as individuals and as humanity, as countries, as cultures, as communities. No institution should be free from the critical look, because, well, we've seen it, haven't we, with the in a microcosm, we've seen it here. What happens when you let those institutions hermetically seal themselves from criticism? Bad things can happen, and bad things can happen to children, to good people, and you know, we've seen in our own time, for example, the state, our state, crossed the line, a line that people within the religious institutions thought they would never cross, to open up a public accountability of what was going on inside the religious space. I remember, just to finish off that point, that a well-known senior cleric saying to me just before the first of the government inquiries into clerical child sex abuse, for example, he said, and I said to him, you know, if you don't take on the role of critiquing yourselves, the state will do it, because the state has an obligation to its people to protect them. And his answer to me was, the state would never cross that line. And a week later, the state crossed that line. So we're in a time when lines are being crossed that in the past we thought were simply impermeable. You could not cross them. You would not cross them, dare not cross them, because these powerful institutions had about them an aura of, you know, impermeability. So I think that's, for me, one of the great things about living in a time when we have massified second-level education, massified third-level education, that we are beginning to develop the courage to cross lines and critique.
So there are a number of those social institutions that have been solidified, as you say. that I'm hoping to talk to you about. And we'll come to religion. Could we start with politics and democracy?
Yes.
I think certainly what's in the news almost every evening and what we've been watching for this past number of years, the rise of populism,
Yes.
with a very particular view of democracy, or what the story it tells about democracy. And I think it's one that we both be familiar with. And it's very much a view of democracy as majority rule. So the populists will say that as long as the majority rule, then minorities don't have rights and minorities can even be vilified and so forth. Could I ask you about, from your experience, in particular, I'm thinking in the peace process in Northern Ireland, there was a journey that Northern Ireland went on in terms of its understanding of democracy, and that democracy isn't just about elections, you know. So I'd like to ask you about that, your conception of democracy, and how, both as your experience, but also as a lawyer, you know, and as someone who's been involved deeply in civil society.
I think the part of the answer, at very least, to that lies in the powerful influence and the overarching influence of our understanding of human rights. I mean, I think life in democracies changed, or began to change, with the arrival in 1948 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Now, that's all it was. It was merely a declaration. It had no legal status. It was, if you like, it spoke from a moral pulpit out to the world, saying, here are principles, here are fundamental freedoms and rights, which we believe attached to every human being, every single human being, by virtue of what some would call the natural law, religious people might call divine law, but actually attached to the human person by virtue of being human. No government concedes them. No government can take them away, though many governments act as if they concede them. Many governments act as if they can take them away or confine them or shrink them. So, that declaration, really, for me, that was a watershed moment in coming out of the aftermath of the Second World War. That was a watershed moment. Another watershed moment was, of course, the arrival here in the European Union of the European Union itself, and drawing into that union those very fundamental principles from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We had, for example, at the broader European level, the Council of Europe, with the European Convention on Human Rights, which again absorbs those principles and says that these are principles which, as pan-Europeans, we hold to be fundamental. It doesn't matter what shape your so-called political institutions are. Here is an overarching shape to which they are answerable. Then we have the European Union, which also draws in those principles, and very importantly, probably one of the most important developments in terms of human rights, the advent of the Convention on the Rights of the Child in 1989, where the child, which means anybody under the age of 18 effectively, is now to be seen not as somebody who is a silent, passive observer and absorber of a bunch of givens that are given to them by adults, but rather as a citizen with rights to freedom of conscience, freedom of thought, freedom of belief, freedom to be educated, freedom of information. In other words, the formation of the child by good parents and by good educators is not to indoctrinate and make them little mini-me's, but rather to help the child to exercise his or her fundamental freedoms, and to understand that every one of those fundamental freedoms is also owned by the person next door, across the street, you know, in a different continent, that every human being they meet also has those same rights. Now, that's a very, very important development. And honestly, Ian, we're only in the opening chapters of absorbing that into our thinking. It's not so long ago that it was perfectly okay, even in our own country, to exclude women from the workplace. There are still certain workplaces, I won't mention them, where they're completely excluded from, but to exclude women from the workplace, for example, when they got married, nobody gave that a second thought. That's the way it was. It would be unthinkable nowadays to make that argument. And in many ways, we are a generation with responsibility now, because we have the education. We are the beneficiaries of free second level education and the massification of third level and the development of critiquing skills, and importantly, of these fundamental freedoms. The fundamental freedom that says you have a right to your own conscience, to your own thoughts, to your own opinions, to your own beliefs, your own religion, freedom to change religion. These things, in my parents' time, these were unthinkable. I don't know about your parents. We both grew up in the same space in Northern Ireland. You're a generation behind me. But growing up in Northern Ireland, particularly in the Catholic community, and I don't think it was all that different, for example, in the Protestant community for that matter. But in the Catholic community, the subservience of what were, in the case of my parents who left school at 14 and 15, who didn't have the heft, the momentum that education gives you, they were passive spectators really of their own lives, and others made decisions for them, decisions about how many children they would have, that whenever their children were born they would be baptized into the Catholic Church, that they would go to Catholic schools, that they would read the following books, that they would be that they would absorb the following doctrines and teachings. Now that nowadays that, if you like, the rigidity of that and the solidity of that is melting, and it's melting under, you know, the heat from critique. And that's the joy of being born into these the post-Universal Declaration of Human Rights generations. We are part of the foment that we are seeing is resistance to that. There are so many areas of fundamental resistance to fundamental rights and the change that they will wreak on humanity, the good change that they will wreak for humanity, when there comes a time, you know, when everyone, regardless of color, creed, gender, whatever, is accepted as a human person with this raft of rights that none of us have the right to trample on, but all of us have a vested interest in protecting and vindicating. Because if somebody can trample on your rights, they can trample on mine the next day. And regrettably, of course, we see, I think the best example of it is one of the best examples of, well, let me just take it back a notch. When I was going to law school back in the late 60s and early 70s, I chose to study law precisely because I believed law because it's such a fundamental holder of community. I felt it was the place and the space in which one could explore the possibilities of change and vindication of rights. But one of the things I didn't reckon on, because from 69 onwards is post-Vatican II, and everything seemed to be open, when they were talking about opening doors and creating gardens, not mausoleums. It was all terribly positive. Civil rights movements. It seemed that we were on a straight line trajectory towards greater democracy, greater fundamental freedoms, greater rights, greater opportunities. And then we realized, I think possibly the best example is what happened after the election of President Obama. When he left office, we realized that there is an opposite and equal reaction coming. The people who you think you've scattered, the polarized, the racist, the sexists, the people who you think you have transcended with our new structures, our new laws, our bevy, our body of international agencies designed to protect and enhance human rights and to protect and enhance the human community, they are up against a formidable enemy. And that is the enemy of all those things. And they just go and they regroup and they reorganize and they come back with ferocity, which is how we get what we see through in the United States, is how we see what has happened in parts of Europe and indeed elsewhere. That human capacity to let the strong arm, the strong arm, dominated by anger and hatred and resentment and racism and sexism and all those ugly things that the human person is capable of, the things that we thought that we were putting a lid on, now we have very strong impulses which are taking that lid off, and if you like, re-legitimating or re-legitimizing their toxins back into the community. So we've just got to be vigilant. I mean, those of us who believe in human rights and the dominance of human rights and the supremacy of human rights, we just have to stop being so naive and, you know, talk back, argue back, and insist on our right to fight back.
I think there's something that you're saying that's common across religion, across economics and so on. And it's a consciousness of what the institution is actually aimed at. So what you've been saying really is democracy is often thought of as, I say, the institutions and the law and the elections. I think we share the same understanding that it's actually aimed, the fundamental aim of it is human flourishing. And
correct, should be.
Should be. And as you say, we're at a very early stage of having that consciousness spread around the world. If you think about the number of women in poverty, if you think about the levels of poverty around the world, if you think about how, you know, political systems don't enable people to develop and also, as you've also said, the loss that is to the world in terms of the, you know, we're only utilizing a tiny fraction of human capacity.
And I look back at our time growing up in the North. We grew up, and this is, I think, very true, not just of Northern Ireland, it's actually true right around the world. One of the most overlooked fundamental plinths on which we stand, and it's more than a plinth actually. You know, it's an energy. It courses through the veins of humanity. Is religious sensibility, and in the West, which, you know, was dominated for such a long time by Christian sensibility, an educated intelligentsia of sophisticated generations have to some extent poo-pooed religion, and in so doing, I don't blame them for being impatient with it, frustrated by it, and determined not to engage with it. But the truth of the matter is, whether they're engaged with it or not, religious sensibility is deeply, deeply, fundamentally engaged with world thinking, with culture, with identity, with how a country develops, how it's shaped, how a people are shaped. I mean, just take a very simple thing. When we were growing up in Northern Ireland, we grew up in a so-called Christian democracy, which was, you know, it's the very idea that you would call that a democracy, but we grew up in is really, really rather sad to think that that was the best that we could muster. Here was a democracy that thought it was all right to exclude one religion. Here were Christians, essentially Catholics and Protestants, vying, in the case of the Protestants, using majoritarian control to essentially proselytize Catholics into becoming, you know, good unionists. And of course, Catholics in turn, growing up essentially in an evangelical and proselytizing tradition, which countered the Protestants weren't real Christians at all. I think one of the big, if you like, it's a braking mechanism, a strong braking mechanism on the full flourishing of the human person, wherever they are in the world, regrettably, has been that tendency of faith systems, more than a tendency, that activity of faith systems in insisting on a kind of a rude evangelism, a rude proselytism, which insists that it will only engage with the other to the extent that the other becomes them. If you're one of the very best leaders in the history of Northern Ireland, and we didn't, it wouldn't be hard to be the best leader because, you know, they were a pretty grim lot for the most part. But one of the best was Terence O'Neill. And if you remember, he lost his job because he felt very strongly that it was time to move away from a Protestant hegemony and the ownership by Protestants of everything, including votes and places in Parliament and government. And he wanted to engage even with a very limited form of civil rights for Catholics. But even he and he was a man that I liked very much. But even he, one of his statements was, that if you treat Catholics well, they will behave like Protestants. Now, that's the evangelical proselytizing at its worst, but in a really good person. And it seems to me that and you meet it in Catholics, Protestants, you meet it in Jews, you meet it in Muslims, you meet it. I don't think you meet it so much in I'm not so experienced in Hinduism, but you meet it in the major faith systems. This rootedness, this historic rootedness in wanting always to change the other. And I think that bunkered thinking, which in fairness, I suppose, to Pope Francis, was challenged last year in Abu Dhabi when he met the Grand Imam, and they set out for the first time a really important document, this fraternal declaration that sets out a series of shared understanding of human rights. That seemed to me to be, now there's a development, modest though, and it's very modest, but modest though it is, it's also quite telling, because, one of the things we overlook, and I think that there's a huge amount of illiteracy around the impact and the influence, the key influence still of religious traditions on our world, our thinking, our dogmas, our doctrines, our practices, our engagements with one another. 5 out of 7 people in the world today identifies with one of the major religious faith systems. 1 in 3 of the entire world population identifies as Christian, and the Muslim population is coming up a strong second there. Very, very soon they'll be able to say that 1 in 3 of the world's population is Muslim, if they can't already say it, because the numbers are growing so exponentially. So I think we need to look at, and as we're probing the kind of things that need to change in our world, there is nothing that is immutable, nothing that is immutable, because that's the human condition. But some institutions have garnered to themselves a veneer of immutability that we can't challenge, we can't critique, we can't unpack. And I think any institution that insists always on a hermeneutic that goes back, a hermeneutic of continuity that goes back to books that are 2,000 years old, 3, 4, and 5,000 years old, and draws from them a philosophy that allows the exclusion of women or gays or attitudes that profoundly impact on the lives of women and gay and LGBTI people in the 21st century. We have to reserve the right to say, hang on a minute, we need to investigate. We need to have the right to critique. If they're not going to critique themselves, and unfortunately many of these institutions, prime among them the Catholic Church, it has to be said, does not have an internal self-critiquing capacity. It has, as many of these institutions have, a deep-seated resistance to self-critiquing and to change. Self-critiquing, unfortunately, very often seen as subversion.
I think there's a couple of phrases come to mind, Mary, as you're speaking. One of them I heard when I was a teenager, and it kind of shaped my life ever since, if you like. It was the phrase, virtually everything that we've been told is wrong. And I think that's as true today as it was whenever I was 15.
Yes.
I think the challenge, another phrase that I've heard more recently, is that the challenge now is to educate the next generation for the real complexity of the world, not to be taking the off-the-shelf solutions that previous generations have messed up an awful lot of, if we're honest about it.
Well, I think you put it very well there and very succinctly. And I think that's one of the reasons why I put so much store by the influence, the growing influence today of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Back in '89, it was and remains a revolutionary development, because really up until then, the model of childhood and the model of child was of a small little person whose welfare was a matter for, obviously, for parents and the state. And in the case of faith systems, the faith system, of course, inserted itself very often in there too. They were seen as not having the right to speak for themselves or to articulate for themselves, but rather they were the passive recipients of all that knowledge, all those doctrines and teachings and givens, and which included political perspectives and religious perspectives. But from 89 onwards, and what's interesting to me is that there's only one country in the world that has not ratified that convention. Every other country in the world has ratified the convention except the United States. It's the most ratified convention in the history of United Nations treaties. So that gives me some hope, because within that treaty, within the convention, all these ratifiers have, all these ratifying states, what we call state parties, they've all said that they subscribe to the principles set out in the convention. So to me, there's a kind of a kernel there, a leaven, that over time is going to reshape how we look at our children. When I was, I'm the oldest of 9 kids born into a family that was Catholic, is Catholic. And I don't know if any of you saw the film Mary, Queen of Scots, the recent one. And I went to see it with my family in the lighthouse in Dublin one evening. And we were sitting in a row, and up came the first thing you see on the screen is a little bit of text, and the text reads, "Mary, Queen of Scots, was born a Catholic." And I nearly had the head staggers. And I said to Martin, my husband, I said, that is just simply factually incorrect. It is theologically, canonically, and every which way, it is absolutely incorrect. And my son Justin said, "Mum, will you shut up? We're all theologically literate in this row. Just let it go. And let's watch the film." But the point is, there is an idea. That phrase captures an idea that somehow a child can be born into a whole body of thinking that is given to them at birth, and over which they have subsequently no control whatsoever. Now, the convention, when I was born, I was baptized into the Catholic Church. You cannot be born into the Catholic Church, not possible, but you are baptized into the Catholic Church. And when you're baptized into that church, two things, two strands, if you like, happen at baptism. One is, the Catholic Church believes that we're born with original sin, and that if you die in a state of original sin, you can't go to heaven. And the Church's purpose in this world is salvation, to get people to heaven. So there's a problem straight off. So the way around that is baptize as early as possible. So Catholic parents are told you must baptize your child as early as possible after birth to ensure they benefit from getting rid of original sin, that they are open to salvation, that they are incorporated into the body of Christ. That's all gift, if you like. The child doesn't have to do anything. Those things are said in Catholic Church teaching to provoke a kind of an ontological change. The person now becomes a Christian, essentially. But there's a second strand to that. And the second strand is man-made, it's juridic. And it says you're now a Catholic for life. You can't ever leave, ever, ever, ever. If you try to leave, you'll be breaking all sorts of rules and you could be punished. And here's the thing, you're now subject to all those rights that you have in human rights law. We reserve the right, the Church reserves the right to crimp them or contain them or restrain them or constrict them in the interests of the Church. And here's a bunch of obligations you now have as a member, and you're obliged and you have a duty. Now, just think about this for a moment. These obligations and this lifelong membership is imposed on a baby of 2 days, 2 weeks, 2 months, completely non-sentient. And we've never really investigated to any significant extent the legitimacy of that position. And yet, 84% of Catholics worldwide, which is like over 1 billion people, became Catholics, became members of the Church as a result of paedobaptism, being baptized as infants. But there is now, it seems to me, if we're going to critique, if we're going to probe what needs to be probed and contested and updated and invoked, we can't just constantly allow the invocation of the New Testament and the Old Testament, when we now have, both of which I adore and love and regularly read, but do not feel nowadays can be read solely in the light of an understanding that existed 2,000, 3,000 years ago, because one of the great tools, in my view, that God gave us is science, is social science, is our brain power, our critiquing power. Now we have to look at those and say, well, hang on a minute now. Do you see those laws that the church made, what we call canon law, the Catholic Church? To what extent has it updated itself in the light of human rights law? And we're entitled to ask that. I'm entitled to ask that question, as I do as a Catholic. Why? Because the Holy See is the only faith system in the entire world which is a state party to the Convention on the Rights of the Child. In fact, it was a Catholic priest, Joe Moorman, whose idea it was to have the convention in the first place, a great champion of children. And you have the church, in a sense, trying to have it both ways, to be a champion of children, but at the same time, not to absorb into its own thinking and into its own law the changed thinking around human rights. So it seems to me that if we were able, if we could involve the world of Islam, if we could involve the world of the Christian churches, some of whom are already down this road, the Catholic Church is not yet, but it's a major key influencer. It is the biggest. The reason that I raise this is not to have a go at the church, but rather the opposite, is to say it is a major key influencer in the world. It is the biggest NGO, bar none, in the entire world. It runs 200,000 schools. Look at the influence it has on children. It has about 70 million children in schools across the world. It has between 300 and 400 million child members. Look at how powerful an influence it could be if it made an option to draw into its laws and processes that the full flowering of that human rights understanding that we all have, every one of us, by virtue of our human condition, our human dignity, right, our freedom of religion, freedom of thought, freedom of opinion, freedom of conscience, freedom of belief, freedom to change belief, freedom to change religion, to walk away. Can you imagine if that edifice that is built currently on control and obligation moved to invitation? What a change that would make in our world for all of us, for all of us. The freedom to challenge doctrine and not to be seen as perverse or subversive, or to, worse than that, to be regarded as having excommunicated oneself. So it seems to me that very often, you know, the answer lies closer to home. There's a lovely old expression in the Irish language that I won't say it in Irish, but it translates as that God's as near as the door. Well, sometimes so are the answers. Sometimes the answers are about deep cleansing that which is right inside our homes, our hearts, our minds, our thinking. It's much closer than we think.
So, thank you, Mary. Our time has flown. We have some time now between now and next 10 or 15 minutes for questions and answers, if you're okay with that.
I'd be happy with that, surely, yes.
Yeah. So we're going to, Clodagh and Brian are going to alternate in terms of asking you some of the questions that have been coming in on the chat while we've been talking.
Thanks very much, Mary and Ian. That was a fascinating discussion. I could listen for another hour at least and longer. It was very rich. There's a number of questions coming in, and I neglected to say at the start to our wider audience, please do use the Q&A function within this application, within MS Teams, to send through your questions, and we'll try and get through as many as possible. Mary, there's a number of questions coming in. One I'd like to start with is, on how can we make progress. And the question related specifically to women's and children's rights, but I'd like to reflect on it against the context of something you said about the resistance to change, the strong arm you talked about, and the need to argue back. And one example of where this has happened in an Irish context recently is in terms of marriage equality, where there were a lot of forces against it, and it was really a combination of different things happening in politics, in church, wider civil engagement, movement, etc. But so reflecting on the experience of the marriage equality change, if you like, that took place across many institutions, how can we make progress? You mentioned argue back actually against a strong arm, which is, as I say, one of the things that was done successfully in the marriage equality. But beyond that, what are the mechanisms? What are the things we can do to make progress in women and children's rights?
Well, the important thing is to organise and to insist on opening up the space for discussion. I mean, I remember I came to Trinity in '75, and one of the first friends I made was David Norris, and along with David and others set up the campaign for what was then Campaign for Homosexual Law Reform, because remember at that time homosexual acts, among others, were unlawful and carried fairly severe penalties. So you can imagine what that must have been like, what kind of life that made for people who were gay. It must have been, and was, I'm sure, for them, an appalling situation. So to start somewhere, and so many good things and so many things that are truthful start around kitchen tables with people just saying, you know, that can't continue. And I think if there is merit and if there is truth in the argument, then somehow, with heft and courage, the space opens up. And when we got 40 years later, may I say, to the same-sex marriage referendum, I mean, there are people who think that it all happened in the 6 weeks leading up to the campaign, but there was 40 years of argument and persuasion, and people being prepared to, in the early days, being prepared to be thought of as odd or eccentric or weird. Out of touch, and the number of people who, who over the years would have said either to me or about me, well, if you don't like the church's teaching, just leave, as if you can, as if canon law would let you. I mean, I can, of course, anybody is completely free to leave. That's the irony of it. We're all absolutely, utterly free as birds to leave, but most people don't understand that. They're held by, what canon law says, that we're bound in perpetuity. So to get that, and here's the message that I'm trying to get across today is rather like that message going back to the same-sex marriage referendum, that there are the ways of understanding truth have changed, thankfully, thanks really in large measure to this huge this heavy duty thinking on human rights and what that means. For example, in terms of majoritarianism, it doesn't mean that just because you're in a majority that gives you the right to impose your thinking on every minority, or indeed on everybody. Because now you have to temper the power you have and understand that power has to be used way, not a divisive way, but in an inclusive way. It changes our thinking. And for me, watching how the gay marriage cause opened up our society, it seems to me one of the great benefits, that one of the great outcomes of the shape of Irish life and the tradition of discussion and dialogue. We're a very intimate kind of community where dialogue, particularly intergenerational dialogue, is commonplace. And we have, our radios and our televisions are full of dialogical formats where everyday issues get beaten to death, flogged to death, and everybody's in on the debate. And that paid off greatly in the case of the same-sex marriage referendum, because people got the opportunity around their own kitchen tables to discuss stories. First of all, we heard a lot more story. We didn't debate these issues just in ideological terms, or in thematic terms, or in grand philosophical terms, or in strict legal terms, or even in strict biblical terms, though a lot of people tried all of those. But somehow the stories of individuals, human beings, good, wonderful, kind human beings, started to filter through as they told their stories of the desperate lives they led as a result of decisions taken by others about their lives. And the injustice of that appealed, I think. The injustice of that led people to say, yes, we're going to do this, we're going to do this. And for me, that opened up, the day after the referendum, when the result was known, the flood of what I would call grace in the community. Call it what you like, it was joy, euphoria. For me, it was real grace. And I wouldn't underestimate for one moment the power of people of faith, people who regarded themselves as good Christians, as good Catholics, who went in and who voted in favor of that on that day, because they believed it was the truth. It was the right thing to do. Now, to get there, it was a 40-year gig, in all honesty, and it's anything but over. It's anything but over. One of the things that I find really quite disappointing is the extent to which we've come this far, but we've also carried the baggage of homophobia with us. And when we look, for example, at, again, one of the major problems we have in our society is youth suicide, and in particular the suicide of young men between 15 and 25, and in particular within that cohort, who dominates that cohort? Young gay men. Where did they go to school? 90% of them went to Catholic school. They went to Catholic schools, primary schools. 60% of them went to Catholic schools, faith-based schools. We cannot ignore. Now, the schools it probably did their level best and are still doing their level best and offer pastoral help and all the rest of it, but still, we cannot ignore those connections. We can't, and yet there is huge resistance to accepting any level of responsibility for the downstream consequences in people's thinking, of being the conduits for that thinking, the formal conduits. The school is a conduit, the church is a conduit, and again, I think we have to, those of us who still live inside those systems and inside those faith systems, and who want to live inside those faith systems a lot more comfortably than we currently do, we have to be able to say, look, can we look at that and ask ourselves to what extent are things we are doing responsible, even though it seems very distant, even though canon law seems a million miles away from the young kid who self-harms, somewhere in Ranelagh. Nonetheless, there are threads of connection that we have got to make to save that child and the next wave of children. We have to disconnect those threads so that the full flowering of the rights they have as human beings, to freedom of thought, to be who they are, freedom of thought, conscience, belief, freedom of religion, freedom to be who they are in terms of gender and sexual orientation, until that day arrives, and we are nowhere near that day. We are, sad to say, we're a lot further than many countries and many jurisdictions, and we've been very courageous, and I think have created a really good dynamic. But if anybody thinks it's over, then we're making the same mistake that the suffragettes made, when they thought that if women got the vote, then full equality for women would follow as night would follow day. Well, it didn't. It just stopped dead. The feet came off the accelerator pedal. So we have to keep the feet on that pedal. And that can make for, being very uncomfortable. And not everybody wants to be that uncomfortable in their lives. Not everybody wants to be up front and, be made to feel like some kind of a agitator. And it takes, I think, grit.
Thanks very much. I'll pass over to Clodagh for, I think we'll take time for one last question. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, Mary. That was fantastic. And I see here in the questions, there's an observation, and I'm going to read it out to you because it captures it beautifully, what we've all been thinking about, how fascinating this speech has been. Yeah, this is not a question, but rather an observation. This is one of the best speeches I've ever heard from a politician, albeit wearing the hat of a professor slash thinker. This really got me thinking and just wanted to appreciate the opportunity to listen to you. So I just wanted to give you that feedback, Mary, coming in from the person hasn't given their name. It's anonymous, but very, very much all of us are valuing this conversation hugely. There are so many questions, and there are questions arising from religion in terms of how do those who might not define themselves as religious join in conversations around religion. What role has the Catholic Church played in advancing, I suppose, sustainability and kind of in the responses to the climate emergency? And also there was another question here that I think fits in very well with what you were saying around giving voice and empowerment and agitating. And it's a question, how can we challenge the other? That is the reaction we see in the US without making other humans the enemy, which creates more separation and division, power struggle and violence. So maybe I'll stop talking now and pass over to you, Mary, and thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much indeed for got the range of those questions. Look, to go back to climate change is a very interesting one, isn't it? I mean, Pope Francis's document Laudato Si really captured the imagination right around the world and put him and the Catholic Church on the front line of activism, at least thinking in terms of activism in relation to climate change as a moral issue in the world and an issue for people of faith to take on board. So I think that he did great work in that regard. He wasn't the first, of course. I mean, it was right. I mean, I think Hildegard of Bingen, it's been around for a while. We've had quite a number of people, great climate protection activists, people who, Francis of Assisi, after whom he took his name, lovers of the earth, who think that we are merely guardians and stewards and that we should exercise that stewardship with great care, caution and judiciously. So I think he has done great work in that regard. But here's the problem. And I think it's a problem that is increasingly in need of redress. The Church has the Catholic Church, and indeed it's not the only faith system, but let me talk about the one that I know. Let others who know better about Islam talk about their own faith system. I'll talk about mine. The Catholic Church has a long history of being speaking out of from a moral high ground out to the world, speaking to the external world, exhorting the external world, sometimes criticizing it, but talking out to the world and telling the world what it ought to do and how it ought to do it. And climate change is a classic example of that. The problem is that when it comes to taking that voice and turning it right around and turning it internally, to turn an internal spotlight on the internal workings of the Church, then it's not good at that. It's highly resistant to that, and that has been its tradition, is a huge resistance to the internal voice of critique. I mean, history is laced with examples of people who tried to do it and it didn't end well. And so there is that huge resistance. It seems to me the Church is now, once governments and government agencies crossed the line and started to investigate issues actually to do not so much with doctrine or teaching, but church management of cases to do with priests, for example, who had abused. Once governments interrupted that hermetic seal that the Church had, right around its moral pulpit, where it could speak out to the world but never looked inwards. Once the innards started to be investigated by governments, we then had hard evidence that managerial practices within the Church were atrocious and were appalling and created victims all over the place. And left a legacy of hurt, not to mention a legacy of distrust now that is eroding the Church from the inside. It's eating it from the inside out, unfortunately, self-inflicted. So it seems to me that the Church itself has a strong vested interest now in updating, in critiquing, in accepting. That's what Vatican II was all about. I mean, John the 23rd saw this a mile off. He knew that it had to update. It simply had to update, but it was resisting updating. And along came the Second Vatican Council with all sorts of new ideas. And then at the end of it, the bishops all went away and left nothing, absolutely nothing in place to carry those new ideas into the future, no vehicle to carry them, except one. And that had to be, unfortunately, the updating of canon law. So the one strong thing that comes out of the council is a new codified system of canon law. Well, for me, codification means almost instant ossification, because again, the code itself is very difficult to update. The only person who can update it essentially is the Pope. So you have ossification built in almost immediately from the 60s onwards at a time of convulsive change that ironically the church all over the world is contributing to, because to the extent that second level education becomes massified, the third level becomes massified, the church is implicated as a leader in that regard, you know. So in a sense, the church has it both ways. It both promotes change, but then institutionally, it also resists change. And I think we need to, you know, the last part of that question related to those people who don't have any faith or who have walked away from faith, and I'd say to them, just because you've walked away doesn't mean you are not affected by, deeply affected by, these profoundly enduring, elderly, ancient institutions that are by far the most important props in the world today. Imagine 5 out of 7 people in the world today identifies with one of the major world faith systems. 1 in 3 Christians. Just think of the power, the absolutely extravagant power of those thought processes, the way in which they hold the individual, how they hold them in their thinking, how they hold them in their acting. And so if you're, no matter where you are in the world, you're working beside them, you're living beside them, you might be married to them, your kid might be one of them, you know, who knows? It is everywhere. And because it is everywhere, we've stopped noticing. We've stopped noticing its power. And we have allowed ourselves, in a sense, to become sidetracked by issues, you know, whether it is the church's teaching on homosexuality, or the church's teaching on the exclusion of women from priesthood, all of which are important, don't get me wrong, they are important. But long before we deal with those, we have to ask, where do these notions about women and homosexuals come from? Well, they come from a document that is at the very least 2,000 years old, maybe 3, maybe 4, maybe 5,000 years old. And is it good enough that today we use that hermeneutic of continuity to create a conduit, you know, back 2,000 years to envelop us today, and in so doing, ignore the wondrous gift that we have of science, of research, of inquiring minds that have helped us to change our minds so many times? You know, is it enough in this world, you know, to be happy to have, you know, our washing machine and tumble dryer and our electric kettle and all those things, and still sit in our house and say to a 16-year-old boy, you know, you're going to go and do a conversion therapy course because there's no such thing as gay? Because that happens today. It's happening in houses, in homes, in Ireland, in America, in Britain. People's lives are being destroyed because we have not. Here we are, say, with all our, you know, we have probably, you know, drones in the front garden and robots doing the lawn, and still we are holding on to these tired, toxic ideas.
Mary, that was, thank you so much for such a well-developed, passionate response. And there are so many more questions, and I have so many questions I would really like to ask you myself. But now I'm going to pass over to Ian, who I know wishes to say a few words himself. Just for information, Mary, the rest of us who are due to present later, we're very happy to actually sit back and pass over the next hour or two to yourself and a conversation with you. We've all really enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
That's my pleasure. My pleasure.
So, Mary, just a few closing words to thank you enormously. It has been an honour. I think in terms of our project, what we're learning, what I've learned, is what you've been talking about all the time is the enormous challenge of trying to realign these institutions with the fundamental tenets of human rights. And the reason for doing that is so that the next generation can reach their potential. They don't have to grow up in oppression. They don't have to grow up for dwarfed versions of themselves because of the institutions that they're growing up within. So thank you for the passionate voice that you have. And as I say, we are absolutely aligned with what you've been talking about, not only in terms of religion. I think the same thing is happening in economics, the same thing is happening in terms of politics. Yeah, these institutions should be freeing up human beings rather than holding us down. So a huge thank you, Mary. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Good to talk to you again, Ian. He's an old pal.
Thank you.
Back in the day, and you make it. You're just superb because you ask the fundamental questions. You ask the questions. Thank you for asking them.
Thank you.
Great. Just to add to Ian's thanks, Mary, and to thank you, Ian. That was a wonderful, phenomenal, very well spent hour. And the questions and the comments coming in reflect that as well. We've really enjoyed that session. It's very valuable, very rich. So thank you both very much. We will now take a break. We are running a bit behind time. We've 2 more sessions. The next session is on reimagining the political economy, and the final session will be on reimagining sustainability. So we'll take a break now, and we'll be back in, I'd say let's come back in 3 minutes, just a quick comfort break, and we'll be back at 3:10. Thank you very much, and thank you again so much, Mary and Ian. Thank you.
My pleasure. Bye. Thank you.